Thank you so much. I'm fortunate today that so many organizations, scholars, activists, and people committed to justice and liberation have already been doing the work of bringing the pressing issues of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex both to public view and to public debate. I stand here because of the important work that so many have done and continue to do to educate the public about the prison industrial complex and to organize people towards its abolition. Abolition democracy is a declaration of interdependence. As Angela Davis and the organization Critical Resistance have argued, the prison industrial complex represents the relationships between corporations, government, correctional communities, and media. Together, these produce a web of tremendous public affect, expenditures, state surveillance, exploitation, detention, and also routine violence. From Angela Davis to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, we know that the increases in the number of people incarcerated, as well as the increase in prison building, doesn't correspond to an increase in crime. What we do have is a society with an increasing number of people living in precarity. So what would it take for you to consent to live in a cage? We rarely think about ourselves when we talk about the prison system. Generally, we have an idea about the type of person or other people we think probably deserve or should be forced or coerced to live out their lives in cages. But the reasons that we have for other people become the reason that all of us are subject to living out our lives in cages. Cages, walls, borders, separation, segregation has been a part of the way that we've organized life in this country for centuries. And it's also continued to produce a culture of suspicion, of distrust, of fear, and certainly violence. In contrast, Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes abolition as a long-term goal and a practical policy program that calls for government expenditure in housing, in healthcare, in education, in all the elements that are needed to produce a productive and violence-free life. Resolving inequalities, providing people with the resources they need, these are the kinds of activities that chip away at the coercion, at the violence and exploitation that are inherent in the prison system. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore poetically states, where life is precious, life is precious. This is, in fact, where the limits of the prison industrial complex and abolition meet, in poetry. When we believe that the only solutions to our social problems is locking people away in cages, our imagination has already been limited by the prison industrial complex. When we believe that locking people away keep those of us on the so-called outside safer, our imagination is being organized by a logic of segregation. We can do better. Our lives are already connected. Many people recognize that there is a problem, certainly. A problem with the current way that we lock people away in cages. But oftentimes, we're not sure exactly what to do about it. I certainly did not wake up like this. I wasn't always convinced by those who argued that we needed to think about abolition when we think about the prison system. I was born and raised in Lompoc, California. Some of you might recognize it from the film Sideways, or you might know it as the flower seed capital of the world. But Lompoc is the Chumash word for lagoon, meaning that it's also been the site of settler colonialism. It's also the site of Vandenberg Air Force Base, which means militarization is also a prominent part of my hometown. And also a federal penitentiary exists in Lompoc as well. But despite all these experiences from my hometown, when I entered graduate school, I was still very skeptical about this question of abolition. I really needed to develop a better understanding of where I was from. Educating myself was such an important first step in starting to chip away from the seemingly uncontested logic that locking people away is the best way we have to deal with social problems. I learned about the racialized way that we police people, and I also came to understand more about the ways that we police and punish sexual and gender nonconformity as well. As I educated myself, I also found out more about what people were doing around me to confront the prison industrial complex. Through my teaching and through my involvement with the American Civil Liberties Union, I had the opportunity to speak with hundreds of people who are locked up. I listened to grievances about the conditions of their confinement. But how many testimonies do we need? 1? 100? 1,000? How many will it take before we recognize that the system of incarceration is in itself corrupt? I started to take these things that I learned about the prison from being inside and connected them to my work as a professor of English at UCSB. And with that came this wonderful question, which is, how might a poem get someone out of jail? You might recall the famous writing by Martin Luther King Jr., his letter from Birmingham jail, where he argues that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all, indirectly. So prison literature is very much concerned with revealing these injustices. Prison literature also centers the voices of those who are on the inside, amplifying them and making us witnesses to their testimonies. We need to refuse recriminalizing them by denying their testimonies and to believe what they tell us. John Edgar Wideman, in his book Brothers and Keepers, writes, "Writing can also be a means of knowing and being in the world. The kind of writing requires self-examination, self-awareness, consciousness of the process of writing and reading. I couldn't write objectively about the prison system from outside without becoming complicit with its primal Manichaean division of the world into inside and outside, evil and good, those categories that its stone walls and iron bars claim to separate. For better or worse, I carry around a prison inside myself." What we may better call the Poetics of Abolition incorporates these various approaches to education, to thinking, sharing, learning, and certainly also to action. Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, To Prisoners, is a wonderful example of the way that we can bring these ideas together, both about writing, but also about poetry as a work of informing, educating, and together envisioning new worlds and new ways of being together. She writes, "I call for you cultivation of strength in the dark gardening in the vertigo cold, in the hot paralysis, under the wolves and coyotes of particular silences where it is dry, I call for you cultivation of victory over long blows you want to give and blows you know you are going to get." So I began this talk by asking all of you what it would take for you to consent to live in a cage. And I've also tried to offer some ways that we might think about how a poem or even poetics could get someone out of a cage, to get someone free. There is a chant often used at protests that I'd like to leave with you as a poem today. It's on the screen if you'd like to say it with me. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Thank you.